They thought they were about to be humiliated. The women stood barefoot on dusty wood, their uniforms torn, eyes fixed on the American soldiers in front of them. The sun was high over the Texas plains, glaring off the barbed wire and silver belt buckles. A translator cleared his throat. Then came the word, halting but unmistakable, "Undress." The camp fell silent. A dozen Japanese POW women stared back, motionless. The moment stretched. One woman, a nurse, blinked. Her hands trembled toward her buttons, and then, before anyone could move further, the soldiers turned away, not in disgust, not in mockery, but in shame. One of the guards removed his hat, holding it over his chest. Another muttered something under his breath and left. The order was rescinded. That day the women expected cruelty and were met with conscience. And for the first time since their capture, they began to realize the real war might be happening inside them now. The sun was merciless that afternoon, flattening everything beneath it into dust and shadow. The train that had carried the women across the belly of America hissed and groaned behind them like some mechanical beast, finally still after days of endless motion. As the doors opened, heat slammed into them, dry and searing, so different from the wet suffocation of the Pacific Islands they had left behind. The land stretched out in wide, empty horizons, Texas plains, sharp and hostile, as if daring them to belong here. A fence of barbed wire shimmered ahead, cutting the camp into a neat square, guarded by towers and watchmen in wide-brimmed hats. Their uniforms were not like the soldiers in the Pacific. They wore boots dusty with cattle trails and belts with silver buckles that caught the light like knives. "Cowboys?" the women whispered, remembering the myths. But there was no romance here, only war and women who had lost. They shuffled off the train in silence. Some of them blinked hard at the brightness. Others tightened the frayed edges of their uniforms, sleeves rolled and collars yellowed from salt and sweat. Most of them had been nurses, clerks, communication aides, roles adjacent to violence but never far from it. They carried no weapons now, only small bundles of belongings. One woman clutched a canteen wrapped in cloth. Another, a younger girl, carried a photo folded so many times the face had blurred to ink and ghost. The line of guards waited in a loose semicircle. Their posture was not overtly hostile, no rifles raised, no shouting, but the silence stretched too long. The women stood still, dust collecting in their shoes, unsure what was about to unfold. Then one of the Americans stepped forward, squinting against the sun. He spoke a few words in English, slow and deliberate, before gesturing to the translator. The man cleared his throat, looked down and said it in Japanese. "Undress." No other word followed, just that. It dropped like a stone in the heat. The air seemed to contract. No one moved. For a moment, it was as if time paused. A handful of women blinked, uncertain if they had heard correctly. Others instinctively backed a step, their bodies stiff with shame, fear, disbelief. One of the older women whispered, "Now it begins," and closed her eyes. The youngest of the group, a nurse not yet 20, reached trembling fingers toward the buttons on her tunic. Her lips were cracked. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. And then it happened. A shift, not in the prisoners, but in the guards. One cowboy, his hat tilted low, looked away sharply, jaw clenched. Another turned his back entirely. A third removed his hat, pressing it to his chest as if at a funeral. No one gave the order. No one needed to. Something in the air had snapped. Not an act of mercy, but of mirror-like recognition. These were not soldiers before them, not threats, just women, starved and sunburnt, their bones visible through threadbare cloth. Not one of them had lifted a fist. They hadn't even spoken. The man who had spoken the order shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat again, but said nothing further. Another stepped forward, gesturing instead toward the barracks. His voice came out rough, but not cruel. "Go on," he said, waving them in. The translator did not repeat the word undress. He didn't need to. Whatever purpose it was meant to serve had evaporated in the heat. The women moved, slow at first, then faster, as though grateful to escape the moment. But something had changed. On both sides. The guards no longer looked directly at them, not out of disrespect, but out of something deeper. Guilt, perhaps? A kind of stunned quiet. Inside the barracks, the women stood uncertainly, holding their bundles, unsure whether to sit, to sleep, to cry. The youngest one found herself staring at the door long after it had closed, not because she feared it would open again, but because she didn't understand what had just happened. Outside, the guards resumed their posts, but the silence lingered. One muttered under his breath, "We're not animals." No one responded. The standoff had ended, but no one had won, and no one would forget. The room the women had been led into still smelled of dry wood and dust, but it wasn't the smell that unsettled them most. It was the quiet. No screaming, no barking of orders, no strip searches, no ridicule, just silence and the occasional creak of boots on floorboards outside, and in that silence something far louder stirred inside them. Confusion. They had been prepared for everything except this. Back in Japan, they had marched in rows, heads high, hearts braced. They were auxiliaries, nurses, signal operators, each trained not just in task, but in thought. Their instructors wore uniforms pressed sharper than their eyes, their voices clipped, precise, drilled in the art of control. But what they taught was not just skill. It was code. Bushido, the samurai's ancient ethic, had trickled into the veins of every lesson. Endure suffering, show no weakness, die before dishonor. That was the refrain. They sang it, wrote it, whispered it before sleep. The idea that capture was possible, even survivable, was never entertained. One woman remembered a single phrase from basic training: "If you fall into enemy hands, you are no longer Japanese." That sentence, spoken in a dim barracks years ago, echoed in her mind now like a curse. They had been taught what Americans did to prisoners. Leaflets passed through the ranks, grainy photographs of charred bodies, mangled limbs, women with torn clothes and vacant stares. One officer had stood before a class of recruits and declared, "Americans feed their prisoners to dogs. They keep women in cages. They will not kill you quickly." Another had laughed, low and grim, as he added, "Better to bite your tongue in half than to be taken." And many believed it. Why wouldn't they? No one they knew had ever returned from American custody. Those who disappeared were presumed dead. And so when the transport ships came, when the war began to falter, and the last orders came to hold ground at any cost, they understood what that meant. Some had carried small vials around their necks, not perfume, but poison. And yet, here they were, alive, fed, staring at wooden beds and blankets folded into corners. It didn't make sense. The stories had not prepared them for the smell of fresh bread drifting through the air, for clean water poured into cups, for guards who looked them in the eye and then, just as quickly, looked away again. It wasn't kindness that undid them. It was dignity. One of the women, older than most, sat on the edge of her bunk that night and muttered, "They treat us like humans." Another whispered back, "Maybe it's a trick." No one answered. A young nurse reached into her satchel and pulled out a small notebook. She flipped to a blank page and stared at it for a long time before writing just 4 words. "I don't understand this." And truly, they didn't. The lie had been so loud for so long, it had become truth. Now, each quiet gesture, each untouched meal, each word spoken, without spit, became a contradiction too large to explain. One woman dreamed that night of a classroom in Kyoto, her instructor pacing before a chalkboard, warning them of the torture ahead. In her dream, the instructor's voice faded, replaced by the quiet rattle of a dinner tray and a steaming bowl of stew. She woke up weeping. The camp had not broken them. It had confused them. And in that confusion, they felt the first cracks spreading in the foundation of everything they had believed. The next morning began with the scent of bacon. Thick in the air, sharp with salt and heat, it drifted through the cracks in the wooden walls like something from another world. The women stirred in their bunks, one by one, eyes blinking open, noses twitching with disbelief. At first, no one moved. They lay still, their bodies starved into suspicion. The smell was too rich, too familiar and foreign all at once. For some, it was the first time they'd smelled cooking fat in years. A bell rang in the yard. Not sharp, not urgent, just routine. They were called to breakfast. Their steps were hesitant as they lined up outside, dust rising around their feet, the sun still soft on the horizon. The guards stood by the mess hall door, rifles slung low, barely glancing at them. Inside, the room was loud with clatter and steam. The women shuffled in and were handed trays, real trays, not tin bowls or buckets, and those trays carried food. Not slop, not ration paste, food, eggs, bread, coffee, and yes, bacon. One woman stared down at her tray as if it had insulted her. She whispered, "This can't be for us." Another sniffed the strip of bacon, eyebrows furrowed in suspicion, then set it aside. She couldn't bring herself to eat it, but the youngest nurse, the one who had almost unbuttoned her shirt when ordered to undress, sat at the far end of the bench. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the fork. She had known hunger so sharp it felt like glass. The moment the food touched her tongue, her entire body reacted, tightened, then melted. Her eyes stung. She swallowed hard. Her stomach, long shrunken, clenched, and then opened like a fist unclenching. Others watched. Some followed. The room filled not with conversation, but with quiet chewing, occasional sniffles, and the hollow echo of dignity being dismantled by a plate of food. After the meal, they were taken to the infirmary, not all at once, but in turns. One of the women had a deep cut on her forearm, still crusted with blood from a fall during transport. She expected it to be ignored. Back in the islands, her commanding officer had told her pain was proof of loyalty. But here, an American medic examined her arm gently, washed it with clean water, and wrapped it in gauze so white it glowed against her skin. He said nothing except, "Okay," and "Hold still." He didn't leer. He didn't touch what he didn't need to. She stared at the bandage long after he left, as if it were some magic trick. She had not been handled with care since she was a child. In the corner, another woman sat with her foot elevated. Blisters from boots long broken had become infected. The nurse treating her hummed something low and tuneless as he worked. The sound wasn't cruel. It wasn't even happy. It was normal. And that somehow hurt more. The Americans weren't yelling. They weren't hurting. They were, in their own way, functioning like the women's own comrades never had. By the third day, things began to shift. The suspicion remained, but it loosened. One woman, after her second bowl of stew, finally asked in halting English, "Why?" A guard blinked at her, confused. "Why what?" She gestured to the bread. "The soup." "Herself." He shrugged. "Geneva Convention," he said simply, and walked off. The explanation meant nothing to her, but the fact that he gave it without malice, that meant everything. In Japan, the phrase enemy had been synonymous with monster, but monsters did not change bandages, they did not serve eggs, they did not hum songs while wrapping blisters. Each act of softness was a strike against everything they had been made to believe. The war had taught them to fear death. But this place, this strange, quiet, dusty corner of America, was teaching them to fear something far more dangerous. Hope. Hope was a dangerous thing to feel when you didn't know if you were allowed to feel it. That's why, when the announcement came, it didn't land with relief. It landed with suspicion. The prisoners were told they could write letters home, not dictated reports, not censored apologies, not confessions of failure. Letters, personal ones, in their own handwriting. At first, no one moved. A sergeant stood at the front of the barracks holding a bundle of pencils and small pads of lined paper. He spoke through the translator, repeating the offer. They could send one letter per month, no more than 25 lines. Names, dates, simple details. They would be reviewed, of course, but they would be sent. The room remained still. A woman in the back crossed her arms and muttered, "It's bait." Another nodded. "They want us to say something wrong, so they can use it against us." These women had lived under the weight of suspicion for so long, they couldn't imagine trust without consequence. They had been trained to expect manipulation, not mercy. The young nurse, who had tasted bacon for the first time just days before, stared at the blank paper like it was a trick mirror. She hadn't seen her mother's face in over 2 years. Her brothers were ghosts in her memory, faces frozen in photographs, their fates unknown. And now she was supposed to what? Write home and say, "I'm comfortable"? Say, "The enemy has been kind"? Still, her hand reached out. Not confidently, not fully, but it reached. That evening the barracks fell quiet. Women hunched over their beds, pencils shaking, silence broken only by the soft scratch of graphite and the occasional stifled sob. What could they say? What should they say? Some tried to keep it simple. "I am alive. I am well. I think of you." Others wrote around the truth, choosing words that might pass scrutiny but still hint at their condition. "I am receiving food. The weather is not harsh. We are treated according to law." One woman, defiant, wrote only this: "To be captured is shameful, but to be forgotten is worse." The nurse took the longest to begin. For hours, she simply stared at the page, her pencil untouched. When she finally started writing, the words came like a flood. "Mother, I was ready to die. I thought the enemy would make me suffer, but I have not known such care in many months. They dress our wounds. They feed us 3 times a day. I sleep without fear." She paused, then added a final line. "I do not understand this war anymore." The next morning, the guards collected the letters. They placed them in canvas sacks and passed them along a chain of hands that stretched beyond the camp. But not all of them made it to their intended destinations. In Tokyo, a small, windowless room housed officers from the Intelligence Bureau. They read the letters with stiff expressions and tight jaws. One reached for a red pencil and underlined the word "kindly." Another circled "coffee" 3 times. A third slammed the paper down and muttered, "If they believe this, they'll surrender too." The letters had become weapons, not of defiance, but of contradiction. Back in Texas, the women waited. No answers came. But something else did. A sense, quiet and trembling, that their words, however small, however intercepted, had still pierced the wall between nations. And even if their families never read them, someone had. Someone now knew they were alive. and being treated like people. And that truth, in its quiet, ink-stained form, was starting to spread. That night, after the letters had been collected and the sun sank behind the flat Texas plains, a guard stepped quietly into the barracks with a stack of folded wool blankets in his arms. He didn't say much, just nodded and set them down on the end of the nearest cot. "Cold coming in," he said. Then he turned and left. One of the women stood, hesitantly picked one up, and ran her fingers over the fabric. It was coarse, but thick, still holding the scent of laundry powder and something faintly sweet. Lavender, maybe. She clutched it to her chest and sat back down, almost afraid to unravel it, as if doing so might wake her from a dream. Across the room, the nurse reached for hers with trembling fingers. For the first time since her capture, she felt the weight of something that belonged to her. Not a shared rucksack, not a rationed bandage, a blanket. Hers. There were no initials stitched into the hem, no markings of nation or war. Just a simple square of warmth. And somehow that hit harder than any speech. They slept under those blankets that night in silence. But it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of minds unraveling. Because if the enemy was supposed to be cruel, if surrender was supposed to bring shame, then what was this? What was this feeling of safety, of comfort, of warmth wrapped around weary shoulders in the dark? A few nights later, music drifted into the barracks. At first, they thought it was a radio from the guard post, muffled and distant. But then it became clear. It was live. Someone was playing a harmonica, slow and low, the kind of tune that settles into your chest and stirs forgotten things. A second voice joined, a piano this time, hesitant at first, then more confident, picking up a melody the women didn't recognize but somehow understood. No one spoke. They simply listened. Some lay with eyes closed, letting the notes carry them to childhood memories, to lullabies sung by mothers now lost or far away. One woman turned her face into her pillow and wept quietly, the music unlocking something no interrogation ever could. Later, they learned it was one of the guards, just a boy, barely older than some of them, who played the harmonica each evening after dinner. "Helps me sleep," he had said once, shyly. Figured maybe it'd help them too. It did. Days passed. The routines grew familiar. And then came something no one expected. Language lessons. It began with chalk and slate. An older guard, balding, with kind eyes, wrote out simple English phrases on a board and gestured. "Hello, my name is... I am hungry. I am tired." At first, the women watched with blank stares. Then one of them, curious, repeated, "Hungry," and touched her stomach. He smiled and nodded. "Yes, hungry." Laughter followed. Real laughter. Light, uncertain, but undeniable. In the evenings, some of the women tried their hand at mimicking American idioms. "Piece of cake," one said, confused. Another replied, "That means easy," and then made a face. "Why cake?" More laughter. Someone drew a slice of cake in the dirt outside, adding a smiley face. It stayed there for days. Books arrived next. Children's books at first. Then short stories, some written in English, others with Japanese translations. They read aloud to one another, stumbled over pronunciations, giggled at missteps. The enemy, it turned out, had jokes, had stories, had dreams, and in that realization came the deepest fracture. Not through pain, not through violence, but through warmth, through music that soothed, through blankets that protected, through jokes that reminded them of being girls, not soldiers. The quietest betrayal was not cruelty. It was kindness, because it asked no permission. It slipped in gently, unnoticed, and made them question everything they had once vowed to die for. Months passed, measured not by calendars, but by the steady rhythm of meals and roll calls. Bread in the morning, soup at noon, meat and potatoes by evening. The women found themselves growing heavier, their cheeks no longer hollow, their bones less sharp beneath their skin. At first, it had seemed like a strange miracle of survival. Then the letters began to arrive. They came in thin envelopes, some torn along the edges, others smudged with ash or dirt, as if they had traveled through ruins to reach this quiet camp surrounded by wire. The guards handed them out without drama, without commentary, and stepped back. Silence would follow, the kind of silence that fell before storms or funerals. One woman unfolded her letter with careful fingers. The paper was brittle, the handwriting erratic. She read it once, then again, slower, as if the words might change if she gave them time. "We live on barley soup now," her mother had written. "The neighborhood mill was bombed. Bread is rare. Your brother trades his coat for sweet potatoes." There were stains on the page, round and faded. Tears or rain, she didn't know. Another letter spoke of ration cards, of lines that stretched through broken streets, of children fainting in the cold while waiting for rice that never came. "We have learned to chew grass," one sister wrote. "It fills the longing, even if not the stomach." The women read in silence, their trays of food untouched beside them. Some pushed their meals away. Others stared at the fat on their hands as if disgusted by its very existence. A young woman who had once shouted slogans of loyalty began to cry, not loudly, but into her sleeve, wetting the threadbare fabric. "I am eating meat," she whispered, as if confessing a crime. "My father is eating roots." The nurse sat on her bunk that night, holding the chocolate bar she had saved for 2 days. It had been a gift from a guard, an attempt at kindness. She had thanked him politely, though her hand had trembled when she took it. Now it lay in her palm, half melted by the warmth of her skin. She looked at it for a long time before breaking it in half and placing the other piece on the empty bed beside her, as if someone might come and claim it. She did not touch it. Soap became their next torment. Each week a new bar appeared in their hands, smooth, pale, smelling faintly of flowers they could no longer picture. They were meant for washing, for cleanliness, for dignity, but to the women they were proof of imbalance. How could there be soap here when children back home bathed in cold water or not at all? How could their skin be free of lice when their families scratched through hunger? Some of them began to give their food away to one another, but even that felt hollow. They all knew where the real hunger lived, and it was not in this camp. It began to divide them. A group of women hardened by years of ideology refused to partake in what they called enemy comfort. They ate only what they had to, rejected extra portions, left blankets folded untouched at the foot of their beds. "They're trying to soften us," one insisted. "They want to make us forget who we are." Others, weaker in body but braver in exhaustion, clung to the kindness. They drank the milk. They took the supplements. They wrapped themselves in the warm blankets and slept without flinching. "If they starved us, they would be the monsters we were promised," a woman murmured once. "But they feed us, so where does that leave us?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, like a prayer without a god. Arguments began to break out in whispers at night. Some accused others of betrayal, of surrender beyond mere capture. "You've grown soft," one spat, noticing the fullness returning to another's face. "You laugh too easily now." The other would answer quietly, "And you are still starving in your head." The guards noticed the tension but did not interfere. They watched quietly as divisions formed between those who clung to bitterness and those who clung to life. And through it all, the food kept coming. The bell still rang every morning. The eggs still sizzled. The coffee still steamed. The portions were unchanged. But now each meal carried a new weight. Not hunger, shame. The kind that doesn't hurt the body, but hollows the soul. It was just a small packet, unmarked, ordinary, wrapped in crinkled brown paper and held together with a string. The guard handed it to the nurse without fanfare, almost casually, as if it were no more than a trinket or a forgotten delivery. She looked down at it in her hands, confused. He gestured toward the corner of the yard, where the soil was softer and the barbed wire cast crooked shadows across the ground. "You can plant them there," he said, "if you want." Then he walked off, leaving her with the seeds and a decision. She stood there for a long while, watching the dirt. Dust blew over it in light gusts. Nothing grew there, not even weeds. It was just a patch of earth like any other, dead and sun-hardened. But now, in her hands, was something alive. Not alive yet, but with the potential for it. That thought hit her like a gust of wind through the chest. In the middle of this place where they had come to survive, where every day felt like waiting, she was being asked, aloud, to create. The other women watched from the barracks window as she knelt down. She used her bare hands to turn the soil, her fingers moving through the dirt with the kind of careful intention once reserved for the wounded. She didn't speak, didn't look up, just worked slowly, gently, as if afraid she might harm the seeds before they'd even had a chance to breathe. When the first seeds slipped into the earth, she exhaled like someone releasing years of something tightly held. As she worked, memories began to rise like mist from the soil. Her grandmother's garden, the scent of wet stone after a summer rain, the rows of radishes and bean sprouts back home in Nagasaki, her mother's hands patting the soil with the same care she now mimicked. For a moment, the war faded. The wire fence behind her disappeared. She was a girl again, with dirt under her nails and the sun on her back, planting for a future that had not yet been taken. In the days that followed, others joined her. Quietly, at first. One woman brought a rusted can to fetch water from the pump. Another used a spoon to dig finer rows. They didn't call it a garden, they didn't give it a name, but something was forming there. Tiny green shoots began to push through the dirt, fragile but persistent. They bent in the wind, but didn't break. The women visited the patch each morning. Some crouched beside it in silence. Others spoke to the leaves, murmuring things they couldn't say aloud inside the barracks. One even sang softly, a lullaby in a language the guards didn't understand but instinctively respected. To the guards, it looked like busy work, a distraction. But to the women, it was more than that. It was proof. Proof that even in captivity something could be nurtured, that the enemy could not stop growth, could not stop small, stubborn acts of creation. One day, a woman touched a leaf and whispered, "We made this." And the others nodded, not in pride, but in awe. The garden became more than a space. It became a metaphor, a mirror. They began to change as the sprouts did. Their skin warmed with sun instead of shame. Their voices softened. They laughed more often. And not the bitter laughter of irony, but the kind that escaped without permission. Surprised, startled, alive, they still wore uniforms, still answered roll calls, still remembered the code they were taught. But now they also remembered something else, that before they were soldiers, they were daughters, sisters, women who once sang to the soil. And with each inch of green, each bloom that pushed up from dust, something inside them was blooming too. Something not even war could kill. It was meant to be practical. That's what the nurse told herself when the camp medic handed her the small, scratched hand mirror. "Check the bandages behind your ear," he said. "Make sure the skin's healing clean." She nodded, took it without thinking, and stepped outside into the dry morning light. But when the glass tilted and caught her reflection, really caught it, she froze. She had not seen her own face in nearly a year. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same girl who had marched through boot camp drills with a rifle on her shoulder and pride in her throat. This face was fuller, the cheeks rounder, her eyes less sunken. Her skin had color again, not just pallor. The hair, though still cropped short and ragged from capture, curled gently near her ears. But it wasn't just the physical change that unsettled her. It was the expression, soft, almost gentle. There was no fire, no hardness, just someone alive. She turned away from the mirror, heart pounding. She wasn't sure why. Later, she returned to her bunk and sat in silence. The mirror lay on the wooden slats beside her like a weapon. She glanced at it again, cautiously, then slowly leaned over and picked it back up. This time, she looked longer. She saw not only the nurse, not only the prisoner, but someone who no longer knew what she was. And that terrified her. Because if she was no longer the soldier Japan had trained her to be, who was she now? That question crept into the others, too. One woman traced the lines of her face and muttered, "My mother wouldn't recognize me." Another whispered, "I don't look ashamed anymore. Shouldn't I?" They had worn their suffering like armor, had clung to pain as proof of loyalty. But now, softened by kindness, warmth, and survival, they were shedding their armor without knowing how or if they wanted to. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Something deeper had shifted. The code they had been raised under, the iron promises of Bushido, had defined their worth through obedience, suffering, and sacrifice. But here the enemy fed them, spoke gently to them, let them plant things, laugh, write, listen to music, and worse, encouraged it. In the quiet dark of one summer night, after lights out, a voice spoke, just above a whisper. The nurse wasn't sure who it was, but she heard it clearly, hanging in the warm air of the barracks like a secret truth. "If the enemy values our lives, why don't we?" No one responded, not out loud, but the silence that followed was heavy, charged, because it wasn't just a question, it was a fracture, a splintering of the story they'd been told since childhood. The enemy was supposed to strip them of their dignity. Instead, he'd handed them blankets. The enemy was supposed to crush their spirit. Instead, he'd given them a garden. Now, the mirror was only the latest betrayal. It showed them not how they had suffered, but how they had survived, how they had changed. Some began asking for combs. Others rolled up their sleeves to tan their skin. One woman even traced her own lips and said, quietly, "I haven't smiled in years." They began to brush each other's hair with fingers. Shared lipstick smuggled from a Red Cross kit made rounds like contraband. The rituals of womanhood, so long buried under uniforms and war cries, were returning, not as weakness, but as reclamation. Still, not all welcomed it. A few women turned their mirrors away, refused to look. "This is how they win," one said bitterly, "by making us forget." But others weren't so sure anymore. Maybe forgetting wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was even healing. And for those who dared to see their own reflection fully, a new thought began to take shape, one they hadn't allowed before. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a future waiting to be claimed. If you're still watching this story and feel its emotional weight, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. It came through the radio first, not in a booming voice or triumphant declaration, but in a clipped, trembling broadcast that crackled through the wires and sank like lead into every corner of the camp. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. There were no cheers, no wild celebrations, just silence, long, uncertain, breathless silence. The guards stood still, their faces unreadable. One of them removed his cap, pressed it against his chest, and stared at the ground as if mourning something he couldn't name. Inside the barracks, the women sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the loudspeaker mounted above the mess hall. The static returned. The moment passed, and still no one moved. For days they had whispered that it might happen. There had been rumors of fire bombings, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reduced to ash, but none of them had truly believed it would end like this. A voice in the air declaring the unthinkable. The emperor's words had been delivered in a strange, old dialect few understood, but the meaning was clear. Japan had bent, the unbreakable had broken, and with it, so had something inside them. They didn't cry, not at first. Grief came slowly, creeping in like smoke through cracks in wood. The war was supposed to end in death or glory, not in translation, not in surrender. That evening, the women were told they would be processed for return, sent home, back to a land they hadn't seen in years, back to families they weren't sure had survived, back to a country that might no longer recognize them, not as soldiers, not even as women, but as something in between, something tainted. They were given canvas bags and told to pack. There was no ceremony, just quiet instructions and the distant sound of American boots on gravel. The women moved slowly, deliberately. Each item was a decision. The blanket that had warmed them through winter nights. Do I take it, or does that make me weak? The book of translated poems. Do I hide it, or will they understand? A folded letter from a guard who had become something like a friend. Can I keep this, or will it shame my family? One woman stared at a tin of powdered milk for nearly 10 minutes before slipping it into her bag. Not for herself, for her brother, if he was still alive. Some left everything behind, refused to carry a single token from the camp. I want to return as I came, one whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. They all knew the truth. They would not be returning as they came. The night before departure, sleep did not come easily. The barracks were heavy with unease. In the dark, someone asked, "What do we tell them?" Another voice answered, almost inaudibly, that we survived. But even that felt dangerous, because survival was not always honorable. They knew what the papers back home would say, that they were captured, that they had eaten American food, that they had smiled. There would be no parades for them, no welcome banners, maybe even no forgiveness. They had dreamed of home, of smells, of songs, of childhood streets. But now home felt like enemy territory, foreign, unknowable. What awaited them was not joy, but judgment. In the final hours before dawn, one woman crept out to the garden. The leaves were thick now, the flowers wide and bright. She knelt, dug a small hole, and buried the mirror. No one asked why. Another folded the harmonica into a rag and tucked it under a floorboard, not out of shame, but out of reverence. They were not erasing what had happened here, only hiding it in places memory could visit when the world was not watching. And as the sun rose over the Texas horizon, a truck pulled into the yard. The women stood in line, hands at their sides, bags at their feet. They were going home. But none of them knew what home meant anymore. When the ship finally docked along the battered shoreline, there were no cheers, no songs waiting, no flags waving in triumph. Just a collapsed port, rust on the cranes, and faces hollowed by years of hunger and smoke. Japan did not welcome them back with open arms. It barely had arms left to open. The streets beyond the harbor were lined with broken buildings, skeletal frames where homes and schools once stood, silent corners where shops had burned and never returned. Children stared at the women from doorways like ghosts watching other ghosts arrive. Not curious, not angry, just tired. The women walked slowly off the boat, their shoes touching soil that should have felt familiar but didn't. It felt foreign, lighter somehow, like everything they had once known had burned away, leaving only the outline of memory. The air smelled of ash and seawater and something faintly sour, like old rice left too long in a bowl. Some of them never saw their families again. The names they searched for were scratched off lists or absent altogether. Others found someone, a sister with thinner arms, a mother bent over, a neighbor who remembered them only as girls. No one asked what they had endured, and the ones who did ask often spoke in whispers, as if the women carried a stain that might spread through sound alone. The country itself seemed to hold its breath. Silence had become survival. People lined up for food just as they once had for air raid warnings. Now, instead of bombs, they feared emptiness. Every ration was counted, every crumb watched. And when the women mentioned American bread or coffee or warm blankets, the room fell quiet. Not in gratitude, in judgment. "You ate the enemy's food," one man muttered in a crowded shelter. "You grew strong while we collapsed." The words cut deeper than any knife ever could. From that moment, many of them stopped speaking about it. The camp, the garden, the harmonica, the mirror. The women folded those memories inward like letters never sent, hiding them behind carefully controlled expressions and practiced silence. They spoke of practical things instead. Rebuilding, work, survival, the new government, the future. But inside, something lingered. The nurse found work in a small clinic outside what remained of her hometown. She cleansed wounds with boiled water and cloth, not the pristine gauze of America. She rationed herbs instead of medicine, and sometimes when she washed her hands in chipped porcelain basins, the scent of soap, cheap and faint, would send her back to the camp, to those first clean bandages, to hands that did not hate her when they touched her skin. She never spoke of it, not once. At night, when the power flickered, she would make weak coffee from roasted substitutes and sip it slowly, not because it tasted good, but because it tasted like a memory that still existed somewhere beyond the ruins. Years passed. The country slowly repaired its bones. Buildings returned. Children laughed again in courtyards. But inside the women, the scars arranged themselves differently. They learned how to hide their softness, how to bury their gratitude, how to silence the parts of themselves that had once bloomed. Society expected bitterness. They gave quiet, yet not everything was abandoned. One of them, the youngest, the one who had first knelt in the dirt, kept her seeds. She did not plant them again. She didn't dare. Not in soil that demanded she forget. Instead, she folded the small paper packet into a cloth and placed it inside a wooden drawer beneath her bed. Years turned into decades. The paper yellowed, the string frayed, but the seeds remained. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would open the drawer and touch them with careful fingers, feeling their dry, fragile presence. She would remember the Texas sun, the soil, the way green had pushed through dust where nothing was supposed to live. She would close the drawer again and continue with her day. She knew something most never would. The real prison had never been the camp. It had never been the barbed wire, the uniforms, or the distance from home. The real prison was the idea they were raised inside, that life only had value through sacrifice, that mercy was weakness, that softness was betrayal. America had not freed them with power. It freed them by contradicting a lie, and that contradiction lived quietly in their bones, even when they never spoke of it, even when the world moved on, even when history tried to erase them. And somewhere in a small room filled with the scent of cheap soap and faded wood, a packet of seeds waited in the dark, a reminder that life had once grown where it was never supposed to, and that sometimes the deepest revolutions happen without anyone ever knowing. If this story stayed with you beyond the screen, like the seeds stayed with her, like the video and leave a comment saying where you're watching from. We read every one, and it helps keep these forgotten stories alive.